I am Dr. Kim Sage. Welcome to my YouTube channel. I'm a licensed psychologist and I am so glad you're here today. This video is part of a larger series I'm doing called Wildly Loved, which I am posting Monday through Friday every week, and hoping to help all of us dive in deeper into understanding what I often believe is our trauma brain, that adaptation and childhood brain that is running the show in our adult lives, even though we're no longer in childhood. This week's entire videos are going to be about hypervigilance, and really at the core what I call low-key chronic hypervigilance. And that's a little bit different than the classic thoughts about what hypervigilance is, and we're going to go into that. And so I'm going to start with explaining the differences and talking about it, and then we're going to go tomorrow into a questionnaire type video for you to do your own assessment. Then we'll go into some sort of deeper conversations around how this affects our lives and relationships, and wrap up the week with a video on things you can do to help if you are noticing, yeah, this really is me. The reason why I wanted to share this topic and really break it down in so many videos was that about 10 or 12 days ago, I posted a video. It's often on TikTok, things you just make and you post. You don't necessarily have any idea what will happen there. And within a handful of days, the video had about 1 million views. It's somewhere up to 2 million now. And you know, for TikTok, it's a different dynamic than YouTube, for example, or Instagram. So you don't necessarily know what's going to do well or not. But it really was one of those videos where I just talked through what I believe happens for so many people. And I was also talking about myself. And it just apparently really resonated with a lot of people. And there were many people that shared that they do the same things. And so that's how I created the checklist, also based on the research I've done on this topic. So I hope you will find this week's videos helpful. If you're new here, please consider subscribing and clicking the bell, and that way you'll get notified when I post new videos. As I said, I'm posting Monday through Friday right now. And also, please check out my online courses on how to remother your inner child, your inner parent, how to understand what happened to you in childhood potentially, and my really just where my heart, I always say, is at a course I spent so much time and love creating from both my personal and clinical experience and research experience. If you were raised with parents, I should say, who had a more borderline or narcissistic type of pattern, and or even what we might call emotionally immature, but really when we break it down, it's much more complicated than that. So please check those out in the links down below. Really quickly, if you had a complicated or complex childhood, and by that I mean, you know, had parents who fit the more classically insecurely attached patterns, a lot of anxiety or avoidance or a combination. You had parents who were unavailable or inconsistent. A lot of, I think, these topics this week will make sense to you about how you can live in this sort of this chronic gear of hypervigilance. So let's talk about classic hypervigilance to begin with. At its heart, it really is a biological method and mechanism to help protect us from danger. It is basically turning on all of our senses and awareness to pay attention to what's happening, to then decide what we might do next, as in like fight or flight or freeze. And it's designed to keep us safe. And so it really is our brain's way of assessing our surroundings and being aware. Now, in a classic, let's say, one-time traumatic event, your hypervigilance after that event, let's say something happened to you walking down the street and there was a threat. And even though nothing even completely terrible happened, it brought up enough fear in you that now every single time you walk down a street at night, you are hyper alert. Well, that makes sense. We want to be on guard. We've already realized bad things can happen. But what happens when it becomes chronic is that it starts to affect a lot more areas of our life, you know, outside of just when we walk down a street at night. It starts to affect, you know, how we approach any new experience, or we might avoid situations. And that's really common, right? Let's say in social anxiety, when we want to avoid our anxiety and we do that, it reinforces that it lowers the anxiety. And so we say, oh, that works. But it also reinforces keeping us maybe, you know, collapsed or not able to try new things or to take risks, because we've learned that not taking the risk feels really good. But over time, that can have a negative impact. So there's like a one-time kind of trauma or traumatic events, let's say, and that affects hypervigilance. So a very classic PTSD response. And that is all of the things when you think about you're really on guard, right? Your pupils are widened, you're in fight or flight, you are at the highest end of being aware. But what happens in a different type of hypervigilance that I'm calling low key hypervigilance and chronic is that, let's say you had a series of events in childhood. Let's say, for example, you had a parent who you just never knew what you were going to get. Like you had to walk on eggshells. They were great. They were, cranky and unstable. They were mad at you. They were fighting with your other siblings or with their spouse. Or one minute you were like the favorite, the next minute you were the worst child ever, or just their mood. Maybe they didn't even direct a whole lot of it towards you, but what you felt in your body because they were chronically fighting with someone else was a lot of chaos and stress. And so let's say you learned, for example, that when you heard the tires roll in on the gravel in the driveway, and let's say this parent was often really irritable after work, you learned very quickly that that was not a time to ask for things, to not have the house picked up or your chores done. You might have learned to always be in your room and be busy doing something, right? Your spidey sense in many regards learned that the tires on the gravel and the car equal danger. And let's say that it also happened on Sundays when they were making, food prep for the next week. Or let's say they fought a lot with a sibling. My point is it happens over and over again. And so you have learned that you need to really pay attention to other people's mood and mind and tone of voice and facial expressions. And you now go out in the world and do that with everybody, because even though, it was just this one caregiver or two, these types of behaviors often generalize to everyone because they are not safe attachment figures. Because how can they be truly safe? Even if they were great when they were great, if they could flip like that, you don't necessarily trust human beings at the core. So you often take this sort of template and apply it to everyone else. And so now in a more low-key hypervigilance, you always think you're doing something wrong. You always think that at any point bad things will happen, for example. You overread and overanalyze and overinterpret people's facial expressions and tone of voice, or even their text messages, or their number of emojis in a text message, right? So there were 4 hearts last time, but only 2 today. What does that mean? And yeah, sometimes we do these things to communicate something with let's say, emojis. But sometimes it's not intentional at all, but it's being interpreted and read that way. So when we think about hypervigilance, there's really 2 main kinds. We're talking about this kind of chronic, low-key type, and then there's the sort of PTSD type. And so collectively, they kind of go into 2 categories. The PTSD type hypervigilance, where we had a bad thing happen, and it's that thing, and we're aware of it. And then a more looming anxiousness, right? Where we're not all the way up here where we're like in fight or flight, but we're pretty darn close all of the time. And maybe when we're not like that, it's only when we are numbing, when we're alone, when we're watching Netflix, when we are in our car. I mean, who knows? And so sometimes we can get a turn down the volume of that, but we often have chronic anxiety and we often have to find ways to deal with it. And many of those are often not helpful. And so we can also see this type of hypervigilance in certain disorders like anxiety disorders, and oftentimes in a borderline presentation of the disorder. We can see it in PTSD, in schizophrenia. There are many places where we can see a heightened experience of hypervigilance that might be trauma related or anxiety related or not, just based on how the person handles emotions and emotional regulation and things like that. So that is really the core of what hypervigilance looks like. In tomorrow's video, we're going to dive deeper into a checklist, or a questionnaire, I should say, on exactly what happens with this disorder. So I will just lastly say, though, that at the heart of the very high-end classic PTSD, you're going to see emotional, behavioral, physical, and interpersonal symptoms, and we're going to talk more about those. But that when you have it in that more chronic way, you still have all of these, but where you really see it are in the emotional and interpersonal areas. So like I was saying, for example, in the very heightened PTSD type, your body, everything is sort of, you can't sleep, your heart's racing, your pupils are dilated, you're breathing fast, you're sweating. That might be the walking down the street scenario. But when you're living in it in a chronic way, it's more going to come out, like I'm saying, and we'll discuss more tomorrow, in how you evaluate your own worth, how you overanalyze others. You might have trouble sleeping and have an anxiety disorder, right? You might have insomnia and restlessness. You might take things really personally in relationships. You might just engage all of the time at this sort of a higher volume than the average person. It's sort of in between that highest hypervigilance and the average, whatever that means, the person who doesn't struggle with this as much. You're somewhere in the middle, and the middle area, that low-key hypervigilance, is what we're going to talk about for the rest of the week. So please feel free to share down below where you notice symptoms. Like I said, maybe after tomorrow, it'll give you an even stronger handle on what I'm talking about. But I'm pretty sure that those of you who had really inconsistent, unsafe, unstable, and even unavailable caregivers, where you were left alone, maybe you were left alone and neglected. And so any noise or startle response is very triggering to you, or there was something that just made you always have to be alert to protect yourself alone. And so we will talk more about that tomorrow. So thanks for watching. Please stay safe and well, and I'll see you tomorrow. Take care.